off, and also with small populations, they don't have a lot of genetic diversity, and so it's very easy for them to actually even like almost kill themselves off. So conservation biologists that use a small population approach study the processes that cause the extinction after these populations become too small. And what's really key here is this cause extinction after the populations become too small, because it's entirely about like what causes extinction within small populations, not necessarily what's causing extinction as a whole. So for example, with a lot of like elephants, a regular conservation biologist might look at poaching, but if the real thing that's killing elephants once their population reaches an incredibly small amount is genetic diversity, that's what your small population approach conservation biologist is going to be looking at. And like I said, oftentimes they're looking at preventing extinction from genetic diversity, because you create this vortex with a cycle of inbreeding, where basically there's no genetic diversity left, and one disease or one genetic mutation that is common among the remaining organisms can basically wipe out the species. And so a lot of times these small population approach conservation biologists are looking for what's called an MVP, or a minimum viable population. And this changes by species, but it's an incredibly important number for them to know, because they can basically set a lower limit as to if the population drops below this level, it's basically almost guaranteed to die out. So there's a method for calculating MVP, because MVP isn't actually necessarily based off of the number of organisms within a population. It's more so based off the number of organisms that can and actively are breeding within a population. So they use this equation: n sub e equals 4 n sub f times n sub n over n sub f plus n sub n, or n sub m. But basically what this is doing is you're finding your effective population, which is n sub e, and in order to do that you take 4 times the number of females times the number of males, and then you divide that by the number of females plus the number of males. And if you have 50, if you have 50 males and 50 females and all of them are breeding, then you will end up with an effective population of 100. Or if you have 50 of each and 40 are breeding of each, then you'll end up with an effective population of 80. And that's essentially how this equation works itself out. So that's for the small population approach. If we move over to the declining population approach, we're going to see that they have a different methodology when it comes to researching how to prevent this extinction. So what declining population approach focuses on is these conservation biologists aren't necessarily even focusing on species that have a small population. They're focusing on species that have a very quickly declining population. Even if the population is far above the minimum viable population, or that MVP. And opposed to these small population approaches, they have significantly more influence on the environmental factors that are causing that. So if we look back towards our elephants example, while our small population approach conservation biologists might be looking towards the genetic diversity issue, what we'd see is our declining approach conservation biologists would be focusing on the poaching issue. So declining approach conservation biologists have a certain set of steps that they use to analyze one of these populations. So first they confirm that the population is actually declining, and then after that they study the history of this declining population and then species that are related to it. So potential predators, prey, maybe if humans are affecting them, and then they develop potential hypotheses that could be causing this decline. And after that they do their best to try and isolate these variables and test those hypotheses. And then once they, think that they have a hypothesis that's true, or they're pretty confident that they have a theory as to why this is happening, then, they'll actually start applying these results to help try and protect these threatened species. So the final key concept I'm going to cover before we move over to Charlie is key concept 3, which is landscape and regional conservation. And basically, we're currently making a shift from conservation efforts focused on a single species to conservation efforts focused on a region. And that's a lot about what this key concept is about. Because in the past, when we focused on conservation efforts, we focused on this one species is an endangered species, and we're going to try and protect it. But we've realized now that in order to really protect biodiversity and protect species, you can't just protect one species and prevent it from being hunted. You have to protect an entire ecological region in order to successfully do that. And moreover, that helps you sustain biodiversity that much more. So oftentimes when humans destroy environments, they create or expand edges, which are areas where two environments meet, creating a unique environment that's not really like either in a lot of ways. And these edges between where, like, for example, like a road and like a forest might meet, or like a lake and a forest might meet, often push out species that previously inhabited that area in the middle ground where the edge wasn't there or wasn't anywhere near as large. And we can sometimes, mitigate these edges with corridors between different like sections that have been cut off, or these different fragmented habitats. But you really do have to have a lot of them to the point where you almost don't have the edges anymore. And so you really do have to try and like maintain this area. And so this concept of an edge is a little bit weird. So it's a little bit easier to explain the diagram. So what you have is this is like more of a natural edge, but oftentimes humans will exacerbate these, where you have this like deciduous forest over here and the grassland over here, and then the edge is this area in between. And so a lot of times with the human development that we're doing is we're creating more of these or expanding them. And what this ends up doing is the species that live in the edge oftentimes end up pushing out the species that live on either side and affecting and hurting biodiversity. So one of the other things that we do is we create these protected areas in order to try and maintain biodiversity in our ecosystem. So 7% of the world's land is in some form of reserve or protection. And a lot of times we try and put these reserves and protections in biodiversity hotspots, which are basically defined as a relatively small area with numerous endemic species that are endangered or threatened. And those species are often chosen to be protected. Most national parks and reserves, however, are too small to actually contain like these hotspots to a sufficient level. And so a lot of times the land surrounding the reserves has to like focus on conservation to a degree as well. So even though this might be land that's partially developed by humans, if you're directly surrounding like a nature reserve, oftentimes they have to make like conservation efforts simply just because that nature reserve isn't really big enough to sustain the hotspot. Some countries have zoned reserves, which basically like puts this in a law where they take an extensive region that includes, like a nature reserve or an undisturbed area that's surrounded by an area that humans have used for economic gain, and they try and make that area that humans use for economic gain compatible with the undisturbed area as best they can through legal procedures. One of the unfortunate realities, though, of these protected areas is oftentimes they focus on species that like humans like or that are big and nice to look at. So, for example, you might see a protected area for like elk, but you're not very likely to see a protected area for an obscure type of cockroach. And you don't see a lot of protected areas in the sea. And so there is definitely a lot of discrimination based off of which areas we protect. Not necessarily on whether or not we're protecting the most or the most important species, but more so if it's the species that a lot of times humans or like tourists are interested in. So the final area that we can talk about has to do with urban ecology, and this is the study of how organisms and the environment in urban or suburban settings. And the book really only talks about like one major example of this, and this really is the only part of urban ecology where you're going to see something that's not the lifespan of a city pigeon really coming into effect, and that has to do with urban streams. Because a lot of like natural species can still live in these urban streams, but the streams are incredibly affected by our urban lifestyle, and so there's a lot of study that goes into this. So some of the major factors that are part of our urban lifestyle that affect these streams are the fact that, first of all, the streams oftentimes have degraded banks, which has a lot of different effects on like the way that species can survive. There's also a lot of increased like water level volatility. So basically, like the height of the water like changes a lot, and this can drastically affect the habitat of different species that are living on or in these urban streams. And then finally, oftentimes we change the nutrient makeup, and this can happen incredibly often as well. Especially with us putting a lot of the things in the streams and the plants and animals that we're removing from surrounding the stream, and all of the like above areas of research are major areas of urban ecology that focus on the urban streams at hand. And so urban ecology really is about taking the parts of the wilderness that wilderness that are still in urban areas and studying them and seeing how we can like maintain the biodiversity in those areas.
All right. Thank you, Porter.
All right. So, with urban ecology, we move on to the next key concept. Key concept 4. Earth is changing rapidly as a result of human actions. And there's really 4 things we're going to talk about within this key concept. And first, that's going to be nutrient enrichment, toxins in the environment, greenhouse gases and climate change, and the depletion of atmospheric ozone. So first we're going to look at nutrient enrichment and the whole idea that human activity often removes nutrients from part of the biosphere and adds them to another. And farming is really a good example and is the prime example of this. So, especially in the modern era with industrial fertilizers, these industrial fertilizers have doubled the nitrogen supply for primary producers due to the fact that mainly nitrogen is lost through agriculture as a resource. However, a problem arises when a nutrient exceeds its critical load, or the amount of added nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus that can be absorbed by plants without damaging the ecosystem. And we're going to see this be a major problem when these industrial fertilizers overload the land with one type of nutrient, namely nitrogen. So, if these nitrogenous minerals in soil exceed their critical load, then they're going to leach into the groundwater or the freshwater ecosystems, which will kill fish and will make the water unsafe to drink, and will have more consequences that we're about to talk about. So, nutrients that get into these streams and into these rivers then also get into the oceans, which have more profound effects, namely by killing phytoplankton. So, when these phytoplankton die, it causes dangerously low levels of oxygen within the water, which is short term, but also in the air long term. These short-term lack of oxygen in the water causes what we call dead zones, which basically drastically lower the amount of life that can live in the water and cause even more problems. So nutrient runoff can also lead to something we call the eutrophication of lakes, which is much similar to the dead zones that are caused in marine areas. So the eutrophication of lakes also causes the same types of death and the same types of dead zone. And we can look at the eutrophication of Lake Erie as a prime example of this. The combination of the eutrophication of Lake Erie and overfishing led to the overwiping of the blue pike, whitefish, and lake trout all by the 1960s. So next we can look at the toxins in the environment, banking off the idea of these nutrients leaking into the environment and causing profound effects. So people are toxic, and we